Hi, I'm John Mekrut, and I'm founder of the Balanced Brain Neurofeedback Training Centers in Los Angeles. We get trapped in these names, trapped in these, I'm this thing, I'm an anxious person, I'm depressed, I'm whatever. And frankly, the names of the things are for the convenience of medical providers, to categorize you, to figure out in an allopathic frame probably what medications we're going to give you. If you get a diagnosis, oh, this person has major depressive disorder. Now we're going to go through the series of protocols that are asked for, that were suggested to me in medical school. And I think we need to dig a little bit under all of that and get away from the label. Anxiety is an expression of the brain not handling something well. That's just one of the many ways things can come out. We as neurotherapists view brain circuitry as the underpinnings of many of the psychopathologies that doctors face every day and that obviously people face. So I think it's more useful for us to think of it in the frame of what are the underlying issues that need to be addressed that can alleviate the symptom that you're expressing and therefore, quote unquote, your anxiety. And that is obviously suggestive of gut health, number one. I think if anybody is watching this, that's the number one thing that you all need to target. That any person struggling with a disorder, and I use that term again advisedly, anybody who's struggling with something, address your gut issues first. Frankly, before you come to me. It would be very useful to really solve a lot of those underlying imbalances in your nutritional health. And then start to address the brain circuit question. That's just my personal belief. There are others who think, oh, you can do it all at once. And you can. I think it's most effective, from talking from a neurotherapeutic point of view, it's most effective if you have a platform of good nutrient quality coming in to support the brain function that you're looking for. So we're looking to change the circuitry in your brain. It has to have the raw materials to take in, to be able to do what we're asking of it. It's got to have the appropriate neurotransmitter content. Dopamine, just to use as an example, 80% of it is, I know, hopefully everybody in the audience knows, is produced in your stomach. So it seems kind of counterintuitive to start taking pills to promote some kind of, neurotransmitter, quote unquote, deficit. Fix your gut problem first, and you'll have the appropriate raw materials, as I said, to support the brain function that we're looking as neurotherapists to try to help you fix. We live in a very stressful world. This is not the world of our ancestors. Our ancestors got by, if evolutionary biologists are correct, on 6 or 8 hours of labor every day. It wasn't the horrifying existence I think a lot of people might think it was, just to get their basic needs met. Now we're living in a much more complicated world where demands are made on all our resources, television, phones, email, texts, Instagram. I'm not on it, but I understand it's very engaging. These are demands on our attentional and our attentional systems that our biology doesn't really support very well. Our circadian rhythms, just vital to our well-being, are not being managed well in our culture. We stay up too late. We engage ourselves far too long. We're chronically short on sleep. So the stresses that add up over in all of those domains end up looking like anxiety. Not surprising. You've burned up all the resources you possibly had and more. And then we try to make up with it with coffee, with medications of all sorts to make up for some of the deficits in function that should be naturally occurring if we were honoring our own cycles. And the cycles are natural. They exist. We need to sleep 7 to 9 hours a day. That's just a fact. Anything less than that, you're literally harming yourself. Your lifespan will be shorter, and you will have more chronic diseases. Those are just data points. So there's so many things in our world today that are putting stresses on us that were not accounted for in our traditional evolution. Neurofeedback is essentially a mechanical way of feeding back to the brain its own circuits for its analysis and adjustment. We're setting up a loop. The person is sitting in a nice comfortable chair, watching something on a screen. That screen is changing in real-time, direct proportion to the changes of energy fluctuations that are happening in their brain. We're reading them through tiny little sensors attached to the scalp. So that it doesn't involve any conscious effort in terms of the person for most forms of neurofeedback, let's say it that way. So we're setting up a loop where the person is witnessing their own dynamics, and the brain itself is actively engaged in that process. It's not about the person thinking a particular way, by the way. The brain itself engages because it's quite interesting to the brain to see its fluctuations, and then it modulates them accordingly because it is designed to do so. All systems, brain, hydraulics, electrical, any system you want to name, seeks a balance, seeks a homeostasis, a balance point of energy consumption and expense. That's a natural state of being. The brain is no exception. So it looks at variations in its performance and tries to strategize how to best achieve that state. It's an extremely voracious consumer of energy. It consumes probably 40% of the calories you take into your body are used up in that little 3-pound thing inside of your head, which in a relative body mass is extreme. So it is designed, very designedly so, God, evolution, whatever you want to call it, designed to find the best way to manage those resources, how to do this in the most efficient way. What neurofeedback does is point out to the brain, look over here, this is, I think, a more efficient way to do this. What do you think? It's a question we're asking the brain. We're not demanding it. The brain goes, oh yeah, that's much better. I use a metaphor a lot in Los Angeles, so I use the metaphor of driving to the airport. You drive the 405 down to the airport until someone tells you to use La Cienega. And you go, oh my God, that's much better. Same thing applies to the brain. We're in the business of pointing out to the brain a more efficient way of doing what it's supposed to do. So it's just a strategy for best performance. Which is why in the holistic frame, that's why you can easily say neurofeedback is a performance training modality. It is not about trying to fix anxiety or depression or any of the other things that people come in here with. We're teaching the brain to perform better. And those symptoms will then abate because they're expressions of that lack of correct performance. Since the brain has finite resources, there's only a certain amount of calories that it can take in and out on a given day, it has to allocate them for best function. So it's going to allocate them for what it perceives to be the correct thing to do. It's often wrong. So what we do by training the brain to observe itself is to say, well, you know what, I don't need all that energy over here. Perhaps I should put some of this over here. So as it reallocates, you find that your performance across the spectrum of things that you need to do in your life improve. You start sleeping better, you start having better focus and attention skills because you're not devoting so much time to your quote-unquote OCD, your obsession about whatever. As that diminishes, you now get to reallocate all that energy to more purposeful engagements for you, the person. So yes, test scores will improve, not because we're making you any smarter, per se, we're giving your brain the ability to perform better at that task because it's not as distracted with other things. Brain performance can always be improved in almost everyone. I'm trying to think if there's somebody who shouldn't do it. And I, honest to goodness, can't think of someone who shouldn't. You can always raise performance. We raise performance in people post-traumatic brain injury, 10, 15 years post-injury. We can raise their performance. So the old neurological saw of 6 months in, that's what you got, is clearly wrong. So anybody's performance can be elevated. I would suggest to you in the audience that it's about putting together a holistic group of practitioners to attack your problems on every level you can. I use my own experience with my own daughter, who we worked through her spectrum disorder challenges with everything we could think of. Diet, behavioral therapies, pharmacology, we did that, neurofeedback, we went down the list. I made no bones that, any one thing was necessarily the thing. Because I'm sure it wasn't. And the neurofeedback was very useful for her. It didn't cure her of autism. She still has issues and challenges around her situation, but it so vastly improved what we were up to versus some of the other things that we were doing, especially pharmacologically, that it was obvious that's the road that we needed to take. But I still say, like I said at the very beginning, I would address the challenges of gut health if you can first, and perhaps put off neurofeedback until some of the more profound issues. I mean, people come with serious stuff. If you have a pretty good diet, great, you're on the road. So if you're struggling with type 2 diabetes, and this is an issue of how and what you eat, depending on where you are on that scale, you might want to postpone perhaps neurofeedback for for months until some of that starts to get under control. As I said, we're looking to give anybody in this holistic frame the best shot they have at recovery. And we don't want people to waste time and energy working on, pushing a rock up a hill. If your gut's not in alignment, the rock that I have to push up the hill with brain training is going to be that much bigger. So do yourself a favor and try to shrink that rock. It's a weird metaphor, but okay, try to shrink that rock, make it carryable rather than having to push it up the hill. Everything works in concert. Psychotherapy, neurofeedback, diet, lifestyle issues. There's a litany of things that are missing in our culture that we all need to put together to be truly helpful. The procedure of neurofeedback is actually quite simple to do. It's a matter of just sitting in a nice comfortable chair and attaching sensors to your head with a sticky paste. The only bad part about neurofeedback is the sticky paste. Because we're looking to immobilize the sensor. Motion, any kind of motion that the sensor picks up, they're extremely sensitive, translates into the machinery and obviously pollutes the signal that we're looking for, the pure EEG signal. So we try to immobilize the sensors as much as possible. So there's a handful of wires. I mean, there are different ways, by the way, of doing neurofeedback. Some involve much more complicated procedures with far more wires or head caps or all sorts of things. Our particular procedures use either 3 or 4, sometimes 5 sensors, and they're just attached to your head, which run back to an amplifier, which run to a computer program. Now, what's actually happening here is we're acquiring the EEG signal in its raw state, and we're splitting it up into the various frequencies that we understand that we need to be dealing with. And we're measuring usually the amplitude of that signal measured in microvolts, and we're presenting it back to the brain in a variation form of a video piece of feedback. They can watch a movie, they can watch constructed digital landscapes and things that we have within the computer programs that we use. But the net result is still the same. The screen will get bigger and smaller, the sound will go up and down, the screen will get dimmer. There are a handful of variations that can happen on that, and they are in direct response to the instantaneous changes that your brain is making in its state. That state measurement is what we're after. What are you doing in their brain? Is it useful to you or not? Is ultimately the question we're asking. Is this useful for your performance, or is this something extraneous? If it's extraneous for whatever reason and it's not serving a function that you can identify, Mr. Brain, I apologize for speaking anthropomorphically, it really isn't that way, but it is also far more than a machine. It's sort of an in-between level of framing the metaphor. But we're asking the brain, is what you're currently doing useful to you for your best performance? And if the answer is no, the brain will immediately recognize it. The trick with the brain is it's sitting inside your head in the dark, floating in some water, some cerebral spinal fluid. It doesn't have direct contact with reality. Everything that comes in, sight, sound, smells, touch, is converted into digital signals that the brain can understand, but it's not actually reality. We're trying to give it very specific, salient information on its performance state. That is not attainable by any other procedure. This is direct. This is actually what you're doing right now. When it has that information, it's very quick to act on it because it's in its best interest. It's looking for, as I mentioned earlier, that homeostasis. What's the best place I can be right now? The difficult job for the brain is it needs to find a calm state, but it also needs to be poised for instantaneous action. That is a knife edge of performance that you can see easily can go very wrong either way. A misinterpretation will send you into an action that's inappropriate, or a non-action equally inappropriate. It's that subtle balance that the brain has to find for all of us, for our best, to be our best selves, is to how to stay in that knife edge of balance, ready to go, but currently calm. And that's the challenge for a sophisticated brain like ours. Lower animals don't have quite the challenge. Ours is incredibly complicated. And then you layer on top language and metaphor and all the very sophisticated things that happen in our brain, and you can see how quite easily things can go awry. The infralow frequency training deals with that default mode network directly, because that's its operating zone, is that low millihertz connectivity within the brain itself. And the other form of training that I use, Dr. Kaiser's DNT program, is more about balancing hemodynamic balances between areas of the brain. We use the Brodmann map. The Brodmann map's been around for 100 and some odd years. It's a very commonly used diagram for functions of the brain. We know very clearly certain parts of the brain are responsible, I say that, use that term advisedly, it is a network, but are more responsible than others, let's say it that way, for certain functions. And because they're connected, when you work with one, you're going to affect a lot of the other neural circuitries. That's a good thing. So we can target someone's sense of self-identity. We can target a spot in their brain that's responsible for their sense of social boundaries, personal boundaries, lots of different aspects, because we know very, very concretely where those areas are located. And imbalances in blood flow are what we're training with that particular kind of technique. It's based on a brain map. It gives the client and me a very detailed portrait of where those imbalances are. It's the reverse of an fMRI. An fMRI scan will give you a portrait of blood flow in the brain. And blood flow meaning, if there's blood flow, there's clearly neuronal energy being expended. That's why the blood's there. Our EEGs, oddly enough, the opposite. We're measuring EEG, and so we know there's a surplus or deficit of blood flow. So we're looking to balance those. Serendipitously, the name of my company, The Balanced Brain, kind of reflects that posture, and that was named long before I even understood how this technique worked. But by balancing those blood flows in those areas of the brain and attracting blood to an area that needs it, means there's going to be more neuronal activity, which means better function. Something that's too activated, has too much energy going on, too much blood flow, we're going to try to retard that blood flow. We're using a technique called operant conditioning. It's a time-honored technique, been around a really long time. So our feeling is that the two of these things together, managing hemodynamics and blood flow for particular spots in the brain, and the underlying regulatory capacity of the infralow frequency domain, that making judgments about salience and what to do and how to carry out actions, and retreating back to the default mode network, is a lovely combination. Dr. Kaiser has accumulated over 30 some odd years of his work in brain analysis, has developed a database, and is very confident in what he calls neuromarkers. These are trait parameters, not state parameters. For anybody out there who knows anything about QEEG, that might be a meaningful sentence, but for the average person, we're talking about areas of the brain that are either underfed or overfed, which result in behaviors. So we call those neuromarkers. This person has the QEEG analysis done, and a portrait emerges. If the portrait has, to use your example, an orange area in the posterior cingulates, we know that person doesn't have enough blood flow in that area to have proper function. It's being limbically driven. There is no cortical oversight, no inhibitory oversight happening in that particular area of the brain. What that means in terms of behaviors can vary widely. The posterior cingulate's largely involved in your sense of purpose, your sense of I'm okay. Upon waking in the morning, I'm okay. I don't have to do anything to change anything in my life. I'm fine. So someone who's underfunded in that area probably is going to be seeking something to change their state. That may be shopping, that may be drugs, that may be, inappropriate relationships, all kinds of things. Something to change their sense of self, that I am not okay. Various other areas can show up. Social boundaries, as I mentioned, personal boundaries, sense of narrative self in the temporal lobe. There's a variety of neuromarkers that Dr. Kaiser has identified as being really clear. If you have this, you have a propensity. It's not guaranteed that you're going to behave that way, but you have a propensity to possibly go that way. Bottom line is, let's just fix it. Let's just draw blood in where we need it. We'll pull blood out from where we don't need it. It's a kind of a graphic imagery, but in a sense, that's what the conditioning does. We're asking the brain, do less over here. You don't need all those resources, do less. Send it over there where it's needed. So by balancing that trajectory across the brain, different areas of the brain, you're going to get overall better performance, period. Trauma is such a tragic, very present reality in our work. Lots of people come in here complaining of a variety of symptoms, and when you start digging down, there usually is some trauma attached to it on some level. It's quite common. Trauma is an interruption. It depends on when trauma takes place. Using developmental trauma, for example, there's a wonderful book I would recommend to everybody called Neurofeedback for Developmental Trauma by Saber and Fisher. It's really a very exhaustive tome on the subject. There's developmental trauma that can happen from early childhood, and there's situational trauma. You lost a job, you got divorced, things that happen. You're in a terrible car accident. They have kind of different approaches often. Childhood developmental trauma is probably the most difficult one because what's missing is the appropriate neurodevelopmental processes that should happen in your life. If you're in an environment where your caregivers are not trustworthy and you're 3, that's going to set up a set of electrical circuit firings that is difficult to undo, but not impossible. That's the good news. But your amygdala and to a certain extent your hippocampus all get involved in presenting internally, what do I need to do about this? The problem with trauma over time is that cortisol, one of the primary secretions that happen in response to stress, trauma being obviously an extreme form of stress, cortisol shrinks the hippocampus, which is responsible for your memories largely. It also, unfortunately, concurrently increases the volume of the amygdala. So now you've got this double whammy happening in trauma where the flood of cortisol, which is omnipresent, and by the way, this happens in just regular stress, which is why stress management is so important. Cortisol is a very, very powerful substance and needs to be managed as well as it can be because of its destructive elements in the 2 organs that I mentioned. But you get this double whammy happening of I can't remember why I'm supposed to be upset about this thing, and then my amygdala is firing constantly because it has more neurons that it needs. So my response to even the slightest inference of an attack is amplified. So with training, again, with neurofeedback, we're training the amygdala to be less responsive people know the phrase use it or lose it. And it's true in brain work. If you don't use a circuit, the circuit will disappear. The brain is very flexible in terms of creating neuronal assemblies, and when they're no longer needed, to disassemble them. It's a very efficient machine in that regard. Neurofeedback takes advantage of that plasticity of response and retrains parts of the brain to be more or less responsive. So we can literally train the amygdala to reduce its connectivity, to reduce those fear circuits, in a sense, to make them less powerful. And if it's the flip side of use it or lose it. If you're not using it, you will lose it. Those circuits will disappear and become less potent. We're pointing out more efficient, more productive, more calming ways of doing things, which the brain is grateful for. We're shining a flashlight into the corner. Here, look over here. Oh, Lordy, yes, there it is. It goes that way because it's the natural gravitation of its performance. And once it settles into that performance, the other performance will start to disappear. That's the beauty of the whole process of neurofeedback. I think ADHD in most of the kids that I see is probably anxiety. And I come from the same frame of you have certain resources. If you're anxious and you're spending a lot of energy trying to manage your anxiety, you're not going to have a lot left over to pay attention to your math homework. It's not lack of resources. A common question that I ask parents: can they play video games? Oh, Lord, yes, they can play video games for hours. Well, they don't. They have plenty of attention. They have attention in certain, focused interests of theirs. But again, kind of normal for a kid. So I'm reluctant to talk about ADHD as an explosive, huge issue. That I think we need to look elsewhere. I think we need to look to abnormally, ridiculously high expectations of what kids should be able to do. I'll use boys as an example. I don't think any kindergarten boy should be required to sit still for an hour. It's not normal. Kids need to be out playing. They need to be out interacting with the universe. They don't. And this is a management question for schools. I understand the problem. You got 40 kids in a class, and everybody's got to sit kind of quiet, or it's going to be bedlam. So I appreciate that problem. The resources that we're not giving to the schools is what is really more of the answer. Give them more support, give them more teachers, give them more aides, get these kids outside. What do you do when your test scores fall? They do away with recess. That's possibly the dumbest thing I've ever heard. These kids need recess. That's a vital component. Their physical exercise in helping them manage their own stress and their own personal resources is vital. So it's kind of obvious to me that the ADHD thing, I think, is kind of overblown. The dark version is, again, it's a management tool. If you give kids amphetamines, contrarily speaking, many of them slow down. And Ritalin, Adderall are dangerous narcotics. I can't say it any plainer than that. No parent should be doing this. We're playing with incredibly potent chemicals that we're experimenting on with our children. I feel very strongly about this. I experimented on my own child. And all well-intentioned people. We gave her a raft of different medications that, in hindsight, I never should have done. And I feel guilty about it. So I come to it with a certain amount of personal investment in this conversation. We need to find better solutions. Amphetamines are not an answer. The data is absolutely crystal clear. The long-term effects of these drugs are not good for children. They're not good for anybody. Shortened lifespan, physically shorter. Start with that. There's a growth factor involved. We are meddling with forces that we don't really understand. And to use it as a management tool for behavior in the classroom is unconscionable. We look to drugs to give us answers for something. And I will posit that almost without exception, the drugs are either pointless or useless. The answers are not there. If depression was going to be solved by SSRIs, we would have solved it already. That's not it. Yet we still give them out in dosages and in volumes that are staggering. The United States consumes the vast majority of these drugs. There's a reason. We're not any sicker than anybody else. We have no more mental illness than anybody else. We look for that answer because it's convenient. And what's inconvenient is digging down and looking at the root causes of these issues. Why are you depressed? It's not that you're depressed. Why is the answer? I can't fix it with a drug. I can't fix it with a pill. I can make you momentarily feel like you're a little bit better, but if I withdraw the drug, you're exactly where you started. It's clear to me that's not a sustainable reality. There's 2 countries in the world that allow direct advertising to consumers: United States and New Zealand. Is it any surprise that people take drugs? Turn on the nightly news. You'll find a drug for every malady you could possibly envision is going on in your life. And again, it's unconscionable, to me, borderline criminal. I don't understand how this can happen. Go ask your doctor. You have this problem, go ask your doctor. Get this pill. There's a pharmacological business industry, a multi-billion-dollar industry created around this. And that's its meaning. It has no to me, it has so little medical value, I can't comment. If somebody is severely depressed, would I give them a few months worth of some kind of a boosting medication? Sure, you got to get them out of the doldrums. I got it. Dig deeper. That's not the problem. They don't have a Zoloft deficiency. That's not their problem. The parts have to work seamlessly. The contributions, the flow of information into behavior out it's like an assembly line. And if there aren't enough headlights showing up, you're not going to have a car that works very well, or the wheels don't show up on time, to use that analogy. Same is true in brain function. The parts all have to contribute successfully to have good performance and be the output, which is what we're looking for. And I think with the neurodevelopmental challenged folks, that's what's missing. They're parts that aren't communicating well. What neurofeedback will do is encourage those parts to contribute more. You're working too slowly over here. You don't have enough resources. You don't have enough blood flow. You don't have enough neuronal connections. Let's enhance that connectivity for you so that you can contribute to the symphony of life here. A bunch of different instruments are playing, to use that metaphor. Wonderful book, Symphony on the Brain, but it's very evocative of that idea that all of the instruments have to be working in concert to actually have a piece of music that sounds right. If there aren't any drums, it's not going to sound as good as if there were. So that connectivity is the question. How do we promote that and encourage it and help it integrate? And over time, my daughter has very successfully, I think, put together the best integration she has at this moment. I'm not stopping. She just did another round of neurofeedback a few months ago. So there's always more to be done. The good news is in brain training, you can always do more. She's living on her own in an apartment in Burbank and happy as a clam with her roommate and her nice little job that she has, and it's really quite delightful to see her now. As I shared the last time, just to give a recap for anybody who didn't see it, she was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder when she was about 8, and we went down the pharmacological road, and it led us to this non-functioning, vacant-eyed person that was not my daughter. And at that moment, my wife and I decided there's got to be another answer. There has to be some other, again, dig down deeper. Managing her symptoms was not enough. It managed her symptoms sort of with side effects and the weight gain and the lethargy and the appetite, etc. So we clearly understood that was not really a solution. So let's dig deeper. A friend of us told us about this thing called neurofeedback. I'd never heard of it. And so we embarked down that road in conjunction with 10 other therapies. I'm going to be perfectly honest. We were doing lots of different things at the same time. What the neurofeedback provided for her, I view spectrum disorder or developmental delay. There's a whole host of issues around, for us, connectivity. The brain has a trajectory of connection. From the moment you're born, you have very little. You can't witness the world very much. You can't interact with it. You're entirely dependent upon other people, et cetera, et cetera. And as you mature, as an infant matures, it starts to reach out, brings in new sensory information, starts to integrate it. Who am I? Oh, you're a different person. You're you. All of these things start to happen, and it all requires an incredibly complicated, very elaborate connectivity that goes on in the brain. Now, with neurodevelopmental problems, like spectrum disorders, it's about connection. Parts of their brain could work perfectly well, but if they're not communicating with other parts of their brain, then the net result behaviorally is not going to be what you're looking for. You talk about peak performance. Peak performance is just another variation of that. It's like, who should do neurofeedback? Professional sports people do neurofeedback because they know they need a level of performance that you and I perhaps don't need in order to shoot successful free throws in the NBA. Or you want to be a sharpshooter on SEAL Team 6. You better have a refinement of your focus skills that I don't need. I'm fine managing pretty much on my own, but neurofeedback can take you to very, very high heights of performance across the board. And it makes sense. You're training the brain to be more self-aware, to be more understanding of how all the parts fit together, how to work more fluidly, how to relax when needed. Sure, you're going to have better performance. There's truthfully no end to it. Much higher levels than one could attain in a physical domain. People who come in, they don't have a particular issue. Now, sometimes you could do a brain map and you'll find out they actually do that they weren't really aware of. Oh yeah, I guess that kind of is a problem. But let's say they have none. Let's say they have a perfect brain. You can train the brain to be even better. There literally is no end. People say, well, when are you done with neurofeedback? You're going to tell me when you're done. When you're happy with your own performance, that's when you're done. It's not, there's no criteria that I can judge to say, oh, you're fixed or you're fine. You're fine when you say you're fine. We are just scratching the surface, clearly. We've been using, as I described earlier, some techniques that have been around for 50, 60 years. This is not novel by any stretch. Most people don't know about neurofeedback because it was confined for many decades to research facilities because the equipment was so expensive. Now, at least, it's come down to a price point that it can be operated in a clinic by a practitioner. So that's why people probably have heard about it in the last 15 or 20 years. What's coming for the future, the big breakthrough is going to come in sensor technology. That's probably the biggest stumbling block at this point, is acquisition of signal. The delicate quality of the signal and how it's transferred into the equipment is vital. And that's something that has to get solved yet. In the meantime, we're still sticking sensors on people's heads with paste. I've tried a lot of dry electrode headsets and all the rest, and they're coming along, but they're not quite there yet. So neurofeedback, I know, is going to, and maybe in 100 years, we'll look back and we'll have some other idea of where it could go. I love the idea of combining EEG surface electrode neurofeedback with fMRI neurofeedback, which, by the way, exists. The problem with fMRI neurofeedback is a couple of issues. One is it is hideously expensive. It's like $1,000 an hour because it requires this multi-million-dollar machine just to operate it. It's not very good for kids. They have to sit in a dark room in a magnet with the big loud banging sounds and all the rest of it. So it's not very user-friendly. But there's something about the specificity of the fMRI signaling that in conjunction with the surface EEG could be incredible. Somebody's going to have to make a breakthrough on fMRI technology for us to get there. There are probably a half dozen other kinds of we call them neuromodulation technologies available. There's pulse magnetics, TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, which uses a large magnet to move around the neurons in your brain for obviously very profound results. There's transcranial direct current stimulation. There's microcurrent stimulation. There's, I mentioned, pulse magnetics. There's infrared technology, very interesting. There's a product called V-Light, which I'm about to purchase and put in my practice that I was taken with at a couple of different conferences. And it uses light technology to stimulate brain function and change and alter, especially in terms of mitochondrial function. So I think quite useful for dementia, Alzheimer's, even Parkinson's. They're doing research studies on that as well. So there's a lot of new ideas coming out from technologists who are out there thinking about ways that we can gather brain information, change it in some fashion, push it, pull it. You know, there's a lot of various descriptors around how some of these things work. The stimulation technologies are more of a push. Ours, in their head, are more passive. We're letting the brain be in charge of making the decisions. More traditional neurofeedback is more task-based. You know, there's something that you actually have to do during the session in order for the neurofeedback to be successful or not. So there's a variety of approaches. I say honestly, they all work. For a consumer, the difficult question is finding which one that resonates with you, that you think you want to try. I don't think you can go too far wrong picking any of them, honestly, if you're in the hands of a careful, craftful clinician. I don't think this is by any means a do-it-yourself thing. There's a lot of people, can I do this at home? I don't know, it's kind of your brain. I'm not sure if you want to, as well-intentioned as you might be, do you have the technical skills to be able to pull that off? If there's a machine available for home use, it's probably of limited impact. The equipment that we use is very specific. It has very specific parameters, and the training to learn how to use it is ongoing. I mean, it's not for the casual user. So that's a huge dividing line, and I know it's of interest to a lot of people. Is there something I can do at home? Tragically, not at this point. It's not. Maybe in the future. That would be great. I'd be out of business, but that would be great. People have said, oh, you know, the cell phone is as addictive as cocaine. Maybe. or it, it affects the same dopamine circuitry. Possibly. A lot of it becomes a matter of will. We make choices in our life. And and a lot of it is habit. If you are habitually checking your Facebook feed for notifications, you have an addiction problem. It's not the technology. You have an addiction problem, to put it bluntly. Some of these technologies are designed to be addictive. That's the reason they exist. Facebook wants you to stay on Facebook 24/7 if possible, because they're going to sell you stuff. They're going to involve you in their ecology. So a lot of it is just personal will. We have to say, you know what? This is a wonderful tool. There's nothing wrong with the cell phone. There's nothing wrong with the computer. They are incredibly useful tools for getting information. You want to research something. You want to know something. It's right there at your fingertips. It's amazing. I'm not sure if I want to turn my house lights off and I'm using my phone. I can use the switch. So there's an extension from all of that. But a lot of it is we just need to make a conscious choice to disconnect from this stuff. And we have to be very mindful about our children. I mean, the data seems to be very clear on screen usage for small people. If you're 4 years old, you shouldn't be on the internet for 6 hours. That's just kind of obvious in a way, but no, people, and I understand the difficulties around childcare, and it's a convenient babysitter. If I give them the tablet, they're going to be quiet for an hour. I understand all that. It is a choice we need to make as a culture, to disconnect as often as we can, to put these technologies in their place. They are tools. And to not have that be part of our interface with reality. Everybody has noted, I think, the dinner table with everybody's looking at their phone and not talking to each other. It's kind of real, but that's a choice. Put your phone away. And don't put it on the table. Put it away. Because if it's on the table, you're engaged with it. They've done studies on that as well. The phone could be off. If it's in visual eyesight, you are engaged with that device. It's creepy. That's how used to this we've become. So turn off the television, talk to people, spend time with your friends, spend time outdoors, play, do all of the things that we used to do. Take technology as you need it. It's when it becomes that oppressive, overdriving, I must, then you got a problem. And that's not the technology's, well, kind of is, but it's not really the technology's fault. You have control over your destiny. We all have control over our destiny. We have control over what we eat. There's no earthly reason that you can't eat good food. It's just a choice you made. For convenience, perhaps. Yes, it's more convenient to go through the drive-through lane at the fast food joint or go to 7-Eleven and pop up whatever stuff they have in that roly thing I can't even identify. Sure, it's easy, but you're not making a good choice. Think about it for a second. Make a better choice. Is it harder? Probably. It's harder to prepare real food. But if you're going to treat yourself well, if you honor yourself, that's what you're going to do. And if you honor yourself, you're going to maintain relationships with family and friends. You're going to maintain a spiritual life. You're going to go into nature. You're going to do all those things because it's you. You will die early if you don't. It's that simple. And you're going to live a really drastically reduced life until you do. Your quality of life will be seriously impaired. And if you correct those things, you'll be amazed at how much better your life is going to be for yourself, how much better our whole culture will be if we all do that.